All right, everybody. We are here in Nashville. It is the day before the 2023 NHL Draft, Corey, and Nashville is buzzing. We were down on Broadway last night. We watched them take down the awards stage. Naturally, that's what people want to hear on this podcast. No, of course. Let's get into the draft here. And obviously, I think the suspense at the top is not so much on the first pick, unlike last year, but I do think there is some intrigue here in the top five. A strong group at the top of this draft. And I know we've been talking, really, I think most people have been talking through the course of this draft cycle that this is a inevitability that Adam Fantilli is going to go to the Ducks. Do you think that that is a good way to look at this 24 hours before the draft?
It's hard to say. Obviously, no one really knows, what's going to happen. Even when we were going into the draft last year with Uri Slavkovsky, the Shane Wright, Logan Cooley debate at the top, I said at this time last year, I think it's going to be Slavkovsky, but I didn't know. Like I had heard conflicting information about Wright or Slavkovsky, and that's kind of the same situation here. Like I've talked to people in the league who are convinced Fantilli is going second, and I've talked to people in the league who are less convinced.
When you say that, do you think that they are of the mind that maybe this could be Matvei Michkov or maybe this could be Leo Carlsson?
Again, Michkov is a fantastic hockey player, and on pure ability, I myself and many hockey people do think he deserves to be in that conversation. Um, if he was a second overall pick, I wouldn't fall out of my chair, but the chair would rattle a little bit. I would call that scenario highly unlikely, but not impossible. I do think it's about Fantilli versus another one of the centers, and I believe that center is Leo Carlsson.
So we talked about it when we did the mock draft episode with Scott and Chris last week, and you kind of made the case for Leo Carlsson. If you were to distill that down, it pretty much comes down to the hockey sense is the driving force there.
Right. And when I've graded out the players, when you look at my draft rankings and my discussions on these two players, I have Fantilli, by a decent margin ahead of Carlson because of the fact that I think he's a superior skater with superior competitiveness, a better natural goal scorer. And I think on my way I've graded them out, I think the pure skill level is higher. But I think it's that last part that may not be a universal opinion in the league. So let's say you are of the mind that the two have equal skill level. And now you have Carlson, who is a little bit bigger, and he's smarter. And the other guy is faster and harder to play against. If you have that analysis in your head, I think it's a lot closer. And I think that's been again, I don't think there's never universal opinions. There were people in the league last year who thought Wright should have been one. There were people in the league who thought Cooley should have gone one. But and that's kind of the same thing here. There are people in the league who think Fantilli is clearly the guy by a really decent margin. And then there are people in the league who think it's really close between those two guys, and there are people in the league who think they would take Carlson. And I don't know what the Ducks are going to do, but that's kind of been the vibe I've gotten over the last few days to a week. It's probably a lot closer than we've portrayed it over the last few months.
Okay, so let's game that out then and the ripple effects that could cause, right? Because last year, what was seen as a close decision at 1 ends with Shane Wright going to 4.
Sure.
So if it is Leo Carlsson at 2 and not Adam Fantilli, do we presume that Fantilli immediately goes 3?
I think it's very likely that happens. Everything I have heard going into the draft is Columbus's head over heels over Will Smith. I don't know if it's so head over heels that they would take him over Fantilli. I think they would take him over Carlson.
Oh,
I think they would just because because of the skating differential there, and I think they are real believers he is a center. They are real believers he is going to be this high-end skill playmaking guy who can play with pace and be a real difference maker down the middle. And that's kind of the fascinating part about the draft, right? Like we're talking about a debate at 2 between Fantilli and Carlson, but if you just change the players a little bit, and all of a sudden it's not a debate about that; it's a debate about 2 other players, and I guess that's what makes the draft and evaluating prospects so fun is just the way different organizations can see things.
So that's fascinating. So at the same time, it's don't rule out Carlson at 2, But if Carlson gets past 2,
He could go 4.
he could go 4.
Yes, and that it's. I mean, it was kind of the same way last year, right?
Yeah.
Like I kind of thought, like if Wright doesn't go 1, I don't think he's going 2, and like and that's kind of the same analysis there, but with different circumstances.
Interesting. All right, so that's the top 4 broadly. I think we could have an entire podcast, though, Corey, about Montreal, not just what they do at number 5. About 20 minutes before we started recording here, they made a rather sizable trade that I don't know that anybody saw coming here. They moved Florida's first-round pick, and they moved the 37th overall pick in this draft for Alex Newhook. We're going to get to 5 in a second. This is the hot news. Let's start here.
Yeah, I mean, Newhook is a good hockey player. I think he's an exceptional skater. He plays with a lot of energy. He's got good skill, good hockey sense. Been a very promising amateur player for several years. His pro career's gone, good enough. I don't think it's been a flop. I don't think he's being traded here because he's been unsuccessful pro. I think he's being traded here by Colorado because I don't think he really found a niche in that lineup. It's unclear whether he's going to be an NHL center or an NHL winger. Is this guy like is he a high-end scoring type, high on offensive type? I don't think he's really shown he can be that just quite yet in the NHL, but he's still rather young, 22 years old, I believe, as we record this podcast. And so we'll see how the rest of his career goes. I see a guy who could be a top 9 forward in the NHL, whether he's second line wing, third line center, whatever it is. He's a good hockey player. But it's interesting now. Now you look at this Canadiens lineup, and as it's I like how he fits into them. He's a little bit older than maybe some of their more younger players like Slavkovsky or like a Philip Mishar, who will take a few years, or Owen Beck will take a few years. So there's a little bit on the older side. You get a little bit more experience there. But yeah, now we turn to the draft, and you kind of think about their depth chart, and you think about organizational needs, and do you need more wingers? Because I don't think there's a guarantee that Newhook is a center, and now you have Newhook, you have Slavkovsky, you have Cole Caulfield. Does this sign point to a defenseman being the pick at 5, or will they take Ryan Leonard, or will they take Matvei Michkov? We'll find out in a few short hours.
So you talk about kind of Newhook can be that second line wing, third line center. I think when you and I were looking through their lineup, we kind of agreed if you had to choose between playing Kirby Dach or Newhook at center, you're probably leaning Dach.
I agree, but Dach wasn't even a full-time center last year. I think he still needs to prove it. Newhook still needs to prove it. I imagine one of those two will work out down the middle. I can't tell you for sure which one, but Dach has more of the prototypical traits. That's why he went 3rd overall in the same draft, I believe. Yeah, the same draft as Newhook.
Where I'm going with this, and you touched on it a minute ago, the implications that it has on the pick and to use a winger. Ryan Leonard is a very different player from Alex Newhook.
Yes.
But when you talk about then you go from your 2 top assets in last year's draft, Slavkovsky and then Mishar. They obviously trade one of those for Dach, so I guess maybe we should count that. But and then you come back and you trade one of your firsts for Alex Newhook. Can you use again a top 5 pick on another winger using all these premium assets on wingers?
It's a good conversation, and listen, if you really believe in Ryan Leonard, because there are people in the league who think Ryan Leonard is a high echelon guy. Not everybody does. I think there are some reasonable concerns on the offensive upside there, despite the 50 goal season. He was, I think you look at his production versus his 2 NTDP line mates, he was the clear 3rd best on that line from an offensive production standpoint. Doesn't mean it's going to be from a pro translation standpoint. So I think there's all reasonable debates. Some people think he could be Gabriel Landeskog. Some people think he's going to be, just a second line power winger kind of thing. So it depends where you fall on that question. But it is, from a roster construction standpoint, it's very interesting because I think if you think it's close, and I don't know what Montreal thinks, but if you think it's close, history tends to tell me the team takes the defenseman in that scenario. And they do that because the position is very valuable. I don't know where David Reinbacher is going to go. He can go to Montreal at 5, he can go Arizona at 6, Philly at 7. I don't know where he's going to land. But I have found the discussion around Reinbacher leading to this draft very, I would say, confusing. I kind of see he's viewed in the public discussions I've seen as like this low upside pick, the safe guy. You're reaching for a defenseman. These are all things I've seen in our articles or on social media or in discussions with other people around hockey, mostly in terms of like, other journalists. Like constantly, I keep hearing these lines, and it confuses me, frankly, because I mean, I don't know, like what he did this season was pretty rare. not just pretty rare, extremely rare for what he did in the top men's league. To be a legit top 4 defenseman, to put up 20 points, to basically be a really good two-way player against really good professional players at his age. And he has a lot of traits that will translate to the NHL. Like I said, I don't know where he's going to go, but he's definitely not a safe pick.
It is interesting, even if you just contrast it with Simon Nemeth last year, right? Who was in a men's league full time, and I don't know that you could say that as good of a men's league as
no, not even close.
Right, and so I don't think the production that Nemeth had was drastically better. It was 26 points in 39 games. That's pretty close to what
and he had like a huge playoff there, so there's a little bit of some context. But Juracek is the one I think of more when I think of Reinbacher. They're both late birth dates, similar size, right shot defenseman, and the production is, you would argue, similar or better in Reinbacher's case. I mean, again, you can have arguments about him versus Leonard, him versus Dalibor Dvorsky or Michkov or whoever, and come to your own reasonable conclusions. But I kind of refuse the argument that this is like a safe player. Like, I mean, if you compare him to any of the other, top European defensemen that have been picked in the last decade or so, whether it is Nemec or Juracek or Miro Heiskanen or Adam Larson or whoever, like his production is right at the top. And there's upside in this player. I'm not saying he's gonna be like a star, but I mean there's a lot of upside in this player at a position that is very valuable.
All right, here's where I'm at on Montreal, Corey. If they want Reinbacher, if he's their guy, they got to pick him at 5. If they do come to the conclusion, though, that they prefer Ryan Leonard, why shouldn't they try to trade back with either maybe a Washington, a Detroit, a Philadelphia, one of these teams that might want to come up for Matvei Michkov and try to still get Ryan Leonard?
Right.
7, 8, 9.
I mean, it's a possibility, and I think people in the media can get guilty of speculating too much about trades this time of year that never happen and have no grounds in reality. But I think this one has grounds in reality because I think there are unique circumstances in this draft that lend itself to a potential trade up, trade down, whatever you want to call it, at the very top of the draft. In that we have a player in Matvei Michkov who a lot of people agree is a very talented hockey player. And there are some NHL organizations that are very in on this player. And there are some organizations, for a multitude of reasons that we've covered ad nauseum on this podcast, that are very not in on this player. And I think that creates the kind of dynamic there where if you kind of think there's this big drop off after the first 4 centers and you're not in on Michkov and somebody else thinks that's not a 4-player group, it's a 5-player group, then that creates a dynamic, I think, for the trade. And it's why, going into the draft, the 2 organizations that kind of have become well-known-ish that people think are in on Michkov, these are not guarantees, mind you, are Philadelphia and Washington. A lot of people in the league I talk to think they are open to it. Not everybody agrees they are open to it. I would not call it a guarantee. If Michkov is on the clock to Philly, they're taking him. I would not call it a guarantee that if he's on the clock to Washington, Washington is taking him. I would not guarantee those things. But that seems to be the common thought, is that those 2 organizations would be open to making that pick. And I think that creates dynamics with Montreal and with Arizona on could they trade down. And if they value Ryan Leonard, David Reinbacher, Dalibor Dvorsky, you're probably getting one of those guys still, and you might get an extra asset along the way.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to be able to get back to just 7, if you're Montreal, you're still getting one of Leonard or Reinbacher there.
Yes.
But in order for that to happen, Philly doesn't need to do that. They don't, not necessarily. I mean, they may want to get in front of Arizona, but Washington probably has to also be showing interest of jumping Philly to create something like that.
You kind of saw that in the NFL draft last year, coincidentally enough, with the Philadelphia organization, where they traded up the 1 spot to go get Jalen Carter, who was considered a potential high-end talent who dropped down the draft, and they only moved up the 1 spot there, but they did it to secure the player. If you really believe in Michkov, whether you're Philly or Washington or some other organization that might be further down the line, whether it's Detroit or somebody else that really believes in the player, you might need to move up the 2 spots or the 3 spots, whatever it is, to secure your guy if you really do believe in the player and think he can be a difference maker for you.
We know that Michkov is meeting with teams here this week. What kind of questions do you think the teams that may have an interest in him on talent, but may have not been able to get to know him throughout the year, what kind of questions do you think are the most important ones he's going to be answering?
I think the biggest question I'm hearing from NHL people is they just want to know he's going to sign with you. Like you can talk to him about his season and and try to get to know the kid and his personality and and learn about obviously the terrible tragedy that happened to his father earlier this season. But I think the biggest question on everyone's mind is, when that deal is up, are you signing with us? I think that's the big question. And my general sense is that teams have been talking to him and that they feel. I haven't talked to a team yet. I know there's been the rumors about how that Washington scout in Russia had a bad interview with him, for example. But the scouts I've talked to that have interviewed him have come away with positive impressions so far. That could change, as people are talking to him today, as we record this right now. But I think that's the big question on everyone's mind. And I think with an organization like Arizona, that's even a bigger question, right? Because with Arizona, it's there's uncertainty around their organization in terms of their building, the city they're gonna be in when he's ready to come over. So I think that interview will be really interesting.
As we kind of talk about everything around the draft that's happening, one of the other trades I think we should get to today is the Pierre-Luc Dubois deal. I don't know if it's been made official yet, but Murat was tweeting earlier about the progress on it. We were talking at lunch about it. How does this set up LA? And they go from this team that had this sterling prospect pipeline now to maybe as win now as any.
That's why you get prospects sometimes, because not some of them are going to work out. Some of them are going to be part of your next contending core, and some of them are going to be used as trade chips. Brock Faber turns into Kevin Fiala. And again, some prospects work out, some don't. Gabe Velarde is used. Rasmus Kupari is used to turn that into Pierre-Luc Dubois, who's an excellent hockey player. And you still have young players on that roster. Quinton Byfield I think is going to be a really good player for them next season. Brad Clark's probably going to be on that roster next year. Looked really good in the OHL in the second half. Artie Kaliev, he's had some good stretches, some impressive stretches, but he's a really good young player. He'll be on that roster next season. So I think, not every young player works out, but if those guys are working out, then you're really happy with all those good veterans around them.
How about for Colorado on the other end of the Newhook deal? That's a win now team as any. They come away with a couple of picks in the top 40 here. Do you think they should make those picks? Should they be trying to wheel and deal? What would you do there as the Avalanche?
It's a really interesting scenario. It's hard to imagine them using both of their first round picks, but in my thought with the draft is you are making those picks until I see otherwise. I don't think you could ever presume trades are going to happen. And they don't really have a deep farm system by any means. They've traded away a lot of picks in recent years. I don't think it's unreasonable for them to use both of those picks, try and get some actual quality young players in that organization that can be part of their future. It's hard to look at their farm system now and really circle a guy. Do you think you're confident is going to have an NHL career? So I think you can look at that team and say, they need to make those picks.
We've talked about a few of the most interesting scenarios here. When the picks start flying tomorrow, or maybe crawling, it's day one. Which team on the clock will have you on the edge of their seat?
Yeah, I think it's Montreal, and it's really interesting that it's Montreal 2 years in a row, right? Different spots in the draft, but it's, we presume now, if the presumption is off, it changes things. We presume the four centers being Bedard, Fantilli, Smith, Carlson are going in the top four in some order. What that order is, I cannot tell you. But we presume those are the first four picks. We presume it will put Montreal under the gun with arguably the biggest decision to make in the draft. And the decision might be to trade the pick, to be quite honest, but it is a decision they have to make. And it would be kind of fascinating because that's 2 years in a row, different circumstances, first overall versus fifth overall. But I think, the Kent Hughes regime has got their work cut out for them in the early years of their management group.
I know you got your final mock coming out tomorrow morning. I don't want to ask you to spoil too much of it, but is there anything as you've been putting it together, any big change that you've made in the last 24 hours?
I don't know about big changes. Like I said, we're trying to figure out how those first four centers are going to go. That's obviously been something I've been trying to figure out the right order of those guys. As we've gotten closer, I've gotten the sense that there's more Matt Wood love in the league than I kind of anticipated maybe a month or two ago. Strong U18 Worlds definitely helped in that regard. Not getting the sense that there's this big Russian scare. I think, like I said, the impressions of Michkov have been positive. People in the league are very high on Dmitry Simashev. I think Daniel Boot's going to go firmly in the first round. I think it's even possible Mikhail Gulyayev goes in the first round. So I'm not getting the sense, despite everything going on in the world, and obviously we saw the events that went on in Russia over the last couple of days, I'm not getting the sense that there is this big hesitancy to draft Russians right now.
And that's how it played out last year. I mean, when Steve Yzerman had his press conference last week, and he really pointed that out. It hasn't seemed like, you don't know any given GM's feeling on it, but
Sure.
the league as a whole hasn't really dropped these guys too far.
Yeah, I mean, Ivan Miroshnichenko goes 20, which I think was perfectly reasonable given how he had cancer in his draft season. People may say Danila Yurov dropped based on when he was rated, but I thought after kind of talking to people after the draft, I think people may have just may not have had him rated properly, at least considering in term. You can argue whether he's a good player or not, but I think the league was lower on him as a player than maybe the public was at the time. Artem Duda goes high in the second round. Trikazov goes in the second round. Vichelnikov, Paravalov goes relatively early. Those are all guys kind of rated right around that range. So and obviously Pavel Michkov, mind you, playing in North America, he goes 10th overall.
Yeah. You bring up Matthew Wood. I think he's an interesting one because we've talked so much about the skill at the top of this class, and it has so often been through the lens of these smaller guys, your Perreaults, your Bensons. I'm sure I'm glossing over someone I shouldn't be as I go through this list.
Riley Heidt, Andrew Cristall.
Yes, for sure, right. But I think when you have Matthew Wood, that it's not like he doesn't have the skating question, but he does have the size that I think gives you a clear pathway to how he gets around it.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the first time I watched Matt Wood, it was at that U17 event that Hockey Canada put on a couple Novembers ago. I remember like the first time I watched him, I was just blown away by the talent. And you're like, oh my God, this guy's so skilled, so smart. He's huge. He can shoot a puck. Like this guy has a lot of talent. And I feel like the season he had this year went a little under the radar, how good a season he had. He led his Hockey East team in scoring as a 17-year-old. This wasn't a bottom end Hockey East team. They were, UConn didn't have an amazing year, but they were, a respectable team in their conference, and he led their team in scoring. I think if your late first, early second pick does that the year after his draft, you are extremely excited about the player. Never mind a guy who's 17 years old. I mean, that's what, he had a similar numbers to Matty Beniers and Ken Johnson in their draft year. Different players, obviously, different conference. But Matt Wood has a lot of talent, and I think, it's right around the 10 mark, maybe 9, maybe 8, maybe 11, maybe 12, 13. I think that's kind of the range he's going to go in. I think there's a lot of love for the player in the league.
All right. Well, should be a good show in Nashville. They certainly know how to put one on, and we will delight in taking it all in. Corey, thanks for doing this. Thank you all for listening to this episode of the Athletic Hockey Show Prospect Series.